the Korean War was a stark contrast to World War II. American airmen did not face advanced anti-aircraft systems or significant air-to-air threats, nor did they conduct nuclear operations against a major power. Instead, the U.S. fought against lesser forces, supported by a global superpower, without the use of nuclear weapons and with few strategic targets. The air campaign focused on close air support (CAS) and interdiction, targeting outdated and ineffective defenses, as American pilots adapted their tactics to meet the demands of a very different battlefield. Compared to the formidable air defenses faced by the Allies in World War II, the Communist ground-based defenses in Korea were both limited in number and technologically outdated. Early American intelligence assessments indicated that North Korean forces were poorly equipped with anti-aircraft guns, presenting far less of a threat to U.S. air operations. While their forward units used 12.7mm or 50 caliber machine guns, the defense of rear areas was left to about 2076mm guns, which lacked radar direction. But these weapons multiplied when the Communist Chinese entered into the war in late 1950. By May 1951, the Communists were estimated to have in action 252 heavy flak pieces and 673 light pieces, increasing and peaking at 786 heavy and 1,672 light guns in early 1953. The Communists' principal heavy flak weapon was the Soviet 85mm model 1939 gun. Some of these heavy flak were controlled by radar in the later stages of the war. The main light flak piece was the 37mm automatic weapon. The Communists also used large numbers of 12.7mm machine guns. Beginning in October 1951, Allied airmen reported unguided flak rockets that reached 10,560 feet. But there are no indications of any successes with this weapon, and reports of its firing faded out by December 1952. Communist flak did not prevent air operations, but it did make them more expensive. Hostile fire forced airmen to fly higher and thus reduced bombing accuracy. The USAF estimated that dive bombing accuracy declined from a 75-foot circular error probable (CEP) in 1951 to 219 feet in 1953, which meant that more sorties were required to destroy a target. Likewise, B-29s that earlier had attacked in what one writer describes as an almost leisurely fashion as low as 10,000 feet with multiple passes, now operated at 20,000 feet or above. Nevertheless, despite increasing red flak, USAF loss rates declined during the course of the war from 0.18% per sortie in 1950 to 0.07% in 1953. Overall American, including Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy, combat losses of 1,230 aircraft on 736,439 sorties amounted to a rate of 0.17%. The airmen believe that all but 143 of these were claimed by ground fire. A further breakdown reveals that USAF losses were not evenly distributed. That is, fighter bombers sustained 58% of aircraft losses, although they logged only 36% of sorties. Jets suffered less than did propeller-powered aircraft, as they operated at higher speeds and altitudes. The Navy's piston-powered F-4U Corsair took hits at twice the rate of the jet-powered F-9F and was considered 75% more vulnerable. Similarly, the USAF's famous propeller-powered F-51 Mustang was much more vulnerable than the jet-powered F-80 Shooting Star. In the period July through November 1950, the Mustang had a loss rate of 1.9% of sorties compared with the Shooting Star's loss rate of 0.7%. The Air Force assessed the loss rate of prop aircraft to be triple that of jet aircraft. During the entire war, the Air Force credited light flak with almost 80% of the downed aircraft and 45% of the damaged aircraft, small arms with 7 and 52%, and heavy flak with 13 and 3%. In early 1952, American losses to ground fire prompted remedial action. One factor in the equation involved how close the aircraft flew to the ground, but, despite the wealth of data from World War II, it apparently took an operations analysis study in early 1952 to bring this fact to the attention of the decision-makers. One study indicated that in the first 4 months of 1952, 5th Air Force aircraft sustained half of their ground fire hits below 2,500 feet. Following a communist flak success on July 10, 1952, 5th Air Force ordered a minimum recovery altitude of 3,000 feet. Similarly, in reaction to B-26 losses, 5th Air Force established a 4,000-foot attack altitude for light bombers with only selected crews permitted to operate lower. In August, the Navy adopted a 3,000-foot minimum pull-out altitude. As a result, losses to flak declined. In the first 4 months of 1952, 5th Air Force studies concluded that ground fire destroyed or damaged 21.6 aircraft per 1,000 sorties, whereas, in the period September 1, 1952 through April 30, 1953, the rate decreased to 11.1 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. Analysts attributed 19% of the decrease to the altitude policy and a further 32% to target diversification. As a counterpoint, the 5th Air Force removed the altitude restriction for 2 weeks in June 1953 and suffered the consequences. During that month, the unit suffered its highest 1953 monthly losses, 18 aircraft to ground fire, including 12 of its newest jet fighter bombers, the F-86F. Another policy adopted by the 5th Air Force in June 1952 limited the time over the target. It mandated that, with the exception of air defense and F-4U aircraft, pilots were to make only one run over a target for each type of external ordnance carried, and it forbade strafing. In August 1952, the 5th Air Force modified the policy by restricting general support and interdiction missions to 1 pass and CAS to 2 passes. American airmen also employed more direct methods against enemy flak. The Marines tried flak suppression tactics in late 1951 or early 1952, with spotter aircraft temporarily diverting strike aircraft to hit flak positions. In June 1952, the Marines published a procedure that put suppressive fire on flak positions 30 seconds before their aircraft began dive bombing runs. Thereafter, Marine aircraft losses dropped. At about the same time, the Army and Air Force adopted similar tactics, although there is no indication that there was any coordination between the three services. Before July 1952, the Army and Air Force operated under procedures established in Plan Negat, which curtailed friendly artillery fire during an airstrike and restricted almost all artillery fire within a 2,500-yard radius of the target. Friendly guns would mark targets with smoke or white phosphorus shells and, between the time the spotter aircraft left the area and the fighter bombers arrived, would fire against known anti-aircraft positions. Prompted by the loss of 2 C-119s to American artillery fire in June 1951, the policy emphasized safety from friendly fire. However, the policy satisfied neither airmen nor soldiers and became even less acceptable to both as the Communists burrowed deeper into the ground, brought up more flak pieces, and learned American air support procedures. Not only did fighter bomber losses remain high, but the procedures left a large area along the front without artillery support for 8 to 45 minutes during the airstrike. Following a meeting between the two services in July 1952, the Army eased the restriction on artillery fire to a minimum time, although it retained prohibitions on the use of proximity-fused and high-angle fire when aircraft were in the area. The airmen now believed that the danger from enemy guns exceeded the danger from friendly guns. In their next step, the Americans actively engaged the flak. On August 6, 1952, the Air Force and Army produced a plan named Suppress, which set out procedures to neutralize suspected and known anti-aircraft positions. While retaining the July artillery restrictions, Suppress permitted the fighter-bomber pilots either to accept or to reject artillery support. The gunners would hit suspected positions with proximity-fused fire before the strike and then signal the end of proximity-fused fire with a radio call and a white phosphorus or colored smoke round. The artillery would continue the bombardment with impact-fused ammunition. During a 1-month experiment, September 25, 1952 through October 25, 1952. With these procedures in the 9th Corps, the USAF lost only 1 aircraft on 1,816 CAS sorties, compared with planning figures of 1 loss for every 380 CAS sorties. Army artillery fired 679,000 rounds in connection with the airstrikes. This marked decline in aircraft losses came despite the tripling of Communist flak guns in the area facing the 9th Corps. The 8th Army and 5th Air Force adopted the policy that became effective on December 2, 1952. Under the slightly modified procedures, a light aircraft T-6 Mosquito led the fighter bombers into the area, marked the target, and after the fighter bomber pilots identified the target, called in artillery fire. Friendly artillery would hit all known enemy anti-aircraft guns within 2,500 yards of the target, first with proximity-fused shells and finally with a white phosphorus or colored smoke round. The barrage continued with impact-fused shells for 3 minutes, as the aircraft attacked. Despite such problems as fighter-bomber pilots not always being ready to exploit the suppression fire and increased numbers of Communist flak guns, fighter-bomber losses remained acceptable. CAS sorties per fighter-bomber loss rose from 917 in December 1952 to 1,285 in January 1953, to 2,981 in late March and early April, then dropped to 1,281 in June, and, finally, rose to about 1,515 in July. The United States Air Force reluctantly and belatedly introduced electronic countermeasures (ECM) in the Korean Air War because of fears that its use would reveal both U.S. tactics and equipment to the Communists. However, the Communist introduction of the MiG-15 that savaged B-29s in daylight operations pushed the USAF to begin ECM operations in April 1951 and night bomber operations in October. Increasing losses at night forced the Air Force to use chaff, a World War II technology, in September 1952. ECM was effective. A post-war USAF study concluded that during the night bombing campaign, ECM cut losses and damage by 2/3. Another defensive tactic used by the USAF in night operations was the direct attack. In 2 separate night attacks on the crucial strategic targets in September and October 1952, the airmen used B-20SIXS at low level to suppress Communist searchlights illuminated by flares dropped by B-29s. But the USAF judged the tactic unsuccessful. American airmen's flak countermeasures were a reaction to losses rather than studied planning or past experience. Effective coordination between the Army and Air Force only emerged after nearly 2 years, with little effort made to share tactics or collaborate with other services earlier in the war. Surely, flak was more important and more costly to the U.S. Air Force than such areas as heckling attacks, rescue operations, and Communist passive defense. This attitude led Air Force Chief of Staff Thomas White to tell his top commanders in October 1957 that the USAF had never respected flak but that it could no longer ignore it. That concludes the full account of the battle between American and Communist flak in the Korean War. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to support us in creating more high-quality videos. Thanks for watching.